Hello friends, Professor Richa Bajaj, who teaches in Hindu College, Delhi University, is there with us to speak on a Native American writer. I should explain in my own way in a minute or so that Americans did not generally keep and preserve the native people of America, and in fact there was a lot of violence against them in the 18th, 19th centuries. And when we hear about a Native American writer, expressing himself or herself, the experiences that one has gone through, then it's a novelty for us, because they belong to a race which faced extermination, and which finally appeared on the scene, and now they are being preserved by the American society. I think they are being welcomed and all. And we have the writer Sherman Alexie, a poet, with us to discuss. And I think Professor Bajaj will tell us about some little history of it, if that is permitted under the time available. And then we'll be face to face with this writer as a writer of values and approaches and viewpoints. So over to you, Professor Bajaj.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Yes, I would like to discuss today Sherman Alexie as a Native American poet. Though he has written novels, memoirs and short stories as well, he's in fact a multifaceted, I'd say literary person, because he's also scripted screenplays and produced movies. So he's also a stand-up comic in that sense. He tried his hand at stand-up comedy. So it's an interesting personality that we are dealing with, very vibrant in many ways, because he constantly experiments with different ways of making use of that creative space, whatever he finds. So there was a point when he wrote, and then he realized that books will not bring home the point to the Americans, because he said the Native Americans, and he said because the Native Americans perhaps don't get to read so much. So he thought that it is a better idea to move to a different creative medium, and maybe movies, or just doing some stand-up acts, etc. He thought that maybe that would bring them to his kind of writing. So when we look at Sherman Alexie, we are looking at a dynamic individual, a kind of a vibrant Native American, who, while he takes forward the idea, the kind of themes that we expect from Native American literature, for instance, working on myths, folklore, song, music, all those, while he talks about them, he doesn't really limit himself to these perspectives. In fact, life on reservation is one of the most important themes that he touches upon. He's known to be, he's the recipient of several awards, both for poetry and fiction that he's received. He's actually known as the, one of the foremost Native American writers who has been able to talk about the Indian reservation that took place in America. And I will give you a sense of what it was like in our discussion today. So he, as a person, grew up he's born in 1966. So he grew up in the 1970s and 70s and 80s is the period when he's grown up in these, on these Indian reservation areas. Now, what is this Indian reservation that we speak of? Now, he grew up in the Spokane region, which is in Washington, but in 1851, the American Congress actually passed an act which was called the Indian Appropriations Act, which was in 1851. Now, according to these Indian Appropriations Act, all these Native Americans, tribes, etc., they were parceled onto piece of land away from their initial habitats. So they were taken away from these places which were basically rich in minerals and mines, where the white settlers wanted to make use the mines, and they wanted to use the minerals from there. So they took them away. They actually pushed them out really from these centers which were very rich in natural resources, and gave them land for relocation, so that they could be relocated on another land, and where they could have their own system of governance. So they could practice, for instance, their tribal culture and their tribal governance, and while still being a part of the Congress, the American, largely following the rules of the American Congress. But these people were driven away from, these very rich forest lands also, because their way of, sustenance was hunting. Right, they would gather and hunt, and so they were forced also in some cases to learn agricultural practices and move to agricultural ways of life. Now this shift in a way also created a lot of displacement, of course, but at the same time this led to large scale sort of epidemic situations also, because they were not tuned to the new place, and mingling with the white settlers who came from different parts in from Europe also created these brought along these diseases that they had not heard of, and so it led to a lot of deaths at that time. Anyway, the reservation system was established, which was highly controversial since it limited access of the Native American people. It meant it was actually done to manage the conflict between the white Americans and the natives, because they thought there was too much clash taking place between the two, and in order to separate them and to give them their own areas where they could govern, these people were put in a place called the Indian reservations. Now, the US then restricted these Native Americans' ability to hunt and fish and gather food, because now they were no more living in their natural habitats, and they had to now, they were on lands where hunting was not even possible. So, I'd like to in fact quote from one of these leaders, from one of these letters that was sent to the US general in 1864, after the Indian reservation system has been put in place. So there was this leader, Jose Pacheco, who said that, and I quote, "I should not have troubled you with this letter, dear General. Did I not think the agents here had wronged us? You and your great father at Washington do not know how bad we fare. Or you would give us food, or let us go back to our lands where we can get plenty of fish and game. I do not think we get the provisions intended for us by our great father. The agents keep it from us and sell it to make themselves rich, while we and our children are very poor and hungry and naked." Unquote. So this is a letter written in 1864 about the condition of such people. What do you think of this?
Well, definitely there was a deep prejudice against these people. In a way, the American population that we call today, and which came from Europe and they settled down in America, they felt threatened by the presence of the Native Americans, and I use the word extermination, and
Yes.
they started exterminating them.
Yes.
So when you do that, and later on you realize your mistakes, and then do some justice to them, then they'll take time to absorb your kind of culture. And if they have atrocities done on them, or neglect to suffer, then they will protest, and it's understandable.
Right. So, this is the background I wanted to give for Sherman Alexie, because these are his forefathers that we are looking at. People who have been witness to people who have suffered this kind of poverty and hunger, and this aspect of, he says, we are poor, hungry and naked. And these are the people.
Yes, and you have quoted them well, because they are talking genuinely about their conditions,
right.
and they are letting it known to others, who matter in the world.
Right. One is also reminded of Chief Seattle's letter, in fact, that he wrote to President Franklin in 1854, when President Franklin had offered to buy the land where they were living, and he had offered the Chief Seattle, that why don't you, we'll buy the land from you. And it's a very interesting letter. In fact, I'd like the students to go back and look up that letter, because there he actually questioned the white man's absurd logic of being able to buy land that he says, in the first place, I don't own this land, nor do you. How can you buy this land which will stay even after you and I are gone? So this land, so the whole idea, of your relationship with nature gets defined in this letter by Chief Seattle, because Chief Seattle says that, we worship this land because this land gives us food. And here you are talking about buying this land as if you can possess it. So there is this kind of a very inherent sort of relationship with nature and ecology that gets defined in this letter, and the Chief Seattle's letter, and that in a way is the very defines the very difference in the perspectives of the two people, the two races. How the Native Americans look at nature, and how for instance the white settlers looked at nature. For them, nature was something that they had to control and exploit, but for Chief Seattle and for other leaders, Native Americans, it was something which was a part of their ecosystem,
In fact,
and they were a part of that
in fact,
ecosystem.
nature was their parent.
Right, exactly. Ancestors, they worship trees.
Yes, yes.
So, so they were a part of their, and they were grateful for nature to, that it could make them a part of this ecosystem. So, I find that very interesting as a letter, where two different, very stark perspectives are defined. So, Alexie has all this behind him, when he's born, but then already all the violence and this kind of privation has been faced by his forefathers in the 19th century. So, as a 20th century subject, and growing up in 1970s and 80s in the reservation, he talks about the culture and he talks about the life of the people in contemporary society. So, what is the Native American like in the 20th century? And this is what he does for us in his works, both in his memoirs, in his short fiction, as also novels, and his poetry. Today, of course, I'm going to discuss one or two poems of Alexie and show you what he does through that kind of poetic act. Now, it's Alexie actually grew up in this reservation, Spokane region, but he very soon wanted to leave this reservation school because he thought that he will not get enough credits to go to any good university. So he decided to move his school for higher studies, and a school which was predominantly occupied by white people. And he stayed there. He was able to win his credits. He became a kind of one of the top students, so much so that he also got a scholarship to the Gonzaga University in Spokane. Again, the people in that university were all wealthy white people, and in a way that created a dent on him, and that left him very insecure, which is why he actually moved. I mean, he got into the habit of alcoholism. Alcoholism, you will find, is one of the major themes in Alexie's works, because he constantly returns to it. And in one of his interviews, he was asked that, why do you constantly go back to alcoholism? He says that this is a reality of my people. He says, my father was an alcoholic, my mother struggled and became sober, I did, my brother did, my aunts did. He said, I'm not an atypical family, or I'm not an atypical subject. Everyone around me is that. And when asked that, why do you think that is a problem? Why did you think that is a reality? He said that is a way of dealing with the crisis that they were facing. And he says that's the way you abate pain. That's the way it takes away the pain. So he says, instead of doing cultural things such as singing, we actually went to drinking. As a culture, we used to sing. But now, as a culture, as a community, now we drink. So it is something. It's a sign of helplessness. It's a sign of crisis. It's a sign of the Native Americans' inability to deal with their present situation. And this is why he keeps on returning to this issue time and again in his works. Now, this was the period when he sunk really low and went into alcoholism, etc. But then, when he switched his university and switched his career option from medicine, he initially thought he'll take medicine, but then he later on joined poetry sessions, and he joined a class on literature. And it is there that he recognized in himself a kind of a creative person, and one of his teachers was instrumental in pushing him in that sphere, and he in fact told him that you can become, you better be a writer because you're really good. So he also calls himself very unacademic, because he says, among all these literature stalwarts, I'm the most unacademic because I have not received these PhDs, or I'm not like a full hardcore academic person. But he moved to, like, it was a kind of love for poetry, for literature, that he moved to writing poetry, and he wrote. He was a prolific writer. Every second year he was publishing collections. His first poetry collection came out in 1992, and he brought, in fact, two poetry collections in the same year. One was titled I Would Steal Horses, and the second is The Business of Fancy Dancing. And both these collections brought him instant fame. He was being quoted, people were talking about his work, and throughout in the following years, he kept writing. Old Shirts and New Skins being another, in the following year he brought, till about 2009, when his poetry collection Face came up. So, and in this period he's been writing, he's written short story collections, he's written novels, he's experimented with different genres. So overall, he's a poet and basically a creative person who's tried his hands at various things. Now, some of the themes that you will find in Alexie's poetry would be very strong sense of satire. You know, he deployed this dark humor in his poetry, and also satire to express actually the struggles of the Indians living in reservation colonies, and talking about, you know, he talks about poverty, he talks about the advent of American capitalism, he talks about alcoholism, as I mentioned earlier, along with this sense of racism that these people experienced at the hands of the whites. So these are some of the you know, and he too struggled with it during this crucial phase in his life, you know, all these experiencing racism in high school and poverty abounding, you know, around him. So his poetry is really a political poetry, and that counters, in fact, dominant history of America. He believes also in the social function of poetry. He is not somebody who thinks that poetry is done for art's sake or has aesthetic function. In fact, he mentions that how poetry brought him out of alcoholism, and he said that when I wrote, then I became sober. When I wrote, then it had a therapeutic effect on me. And he said later that people who read my works also said that they were able to come out of you know, their crisis because of reading. So he highly believes in the social function of poetry in that sense, and uses poetry to recount this kind of, or uses even other modes to recount this kind of historical trauma, and to talk about the history of marginalization and exploitation experienced by his people and his community. So these are some of the basic themes, and, you know, a framework in which you can place Alexie as a writer. I'd like to move to the poem now, if you have,
please,
want to.
yes. No, it's fine.
Okay, so you know, this is one poem which I find very interesting, because in this poem, Alexie, in a way, talks about the idea of how Christianity is inherently for him, you know, biased, and he says that you know, that the title, for instance, of this poem is Crow Testament. Right now, Crow Testament for Alexie, the title itself is important because he hits out at the very sacred text of Christians, right? The Bible, which is old and new, and he, instead of using old and new, but he calls it crow. Right now, testament also means being witnessed to something. Right now, he's trying to bring in the point of view of the crow here, which at, you know, one level perhaps appears to be the case of the Native Americans, but on the other also Christians. You know, the poet desists from spelling out any clear meaning, so you don't know what does he mean by crow. But, you know, the poem actually builds an alternate history, suggesting that the culture of violence is actually inherent in Christianity and can be traced to the beginnings of the world, you know, as in the case of the Genesis, you know. So let me in fact quote from the poem, and you'll probably get a sense of what you know, what he says here. The poem actually begins with and he says, Cain lifts crow, that heavy black bird, and strikes down Abel. Damn, says crow, I guess this is just the beginning. Now this takes us back to the, yes, you seem to be smiling. How do you want to respond to this?
That is because he is using crow to bring out his own condition of oppression,
right,
and he says it very directly.
Right.
And this is how, you know, spontaneously poetry occurs in the case of a writer like this. And this has to play a social role. Initially, you rightly said that poetry brought him out of the addiction, and then he started looking at the world critically.
Right.
And if he writes critical stuff and he doesn't belong to Christians,
right,
therefore he would like to also look at them critically.
Right.
And he finds that that critical thing that is there, it will save him from the wrong influences of the people who rule him.
Right. So, you know, the idea, he's basically mocking this entire practice of Christian missionaries as well, who come out and who set themselves to the task of converting even the Native Americans to Christianity. And he says that and it is premised on the teachings of the Bible. And he says your Bible actually tells you, shows the first signs of fratricide, where Cain, with the first story of Cain and Abel, where brother kills brother. And if you look at it in terms of, of, you know, how Native Americans and Americans project themselves as brothers. He says that one brother has killed the other brother, right? So the white Americans have killed and have destroyed entirely the other brother. And so, you know, that is one angle to look at it, that when you look at Cain and Abel, then you're looking at two civilizations or two races, where one race has completely destroyed and massacred the other race. But on the other hand, if you look at it as just as a story from Genesis 4 from the Old Testament, then it describes a day. Let me also give the viewers a sense of what the story is from the Bible. Now, you find that in Genesis 4, Cain and Abel, both of whom are basically Adam and Eve's sons, right? Now, it describes the day when Cain and Abel presented the Lord with offerings, and they're supposed to give a gift to the God, and Cain brings some fruits from his land because he's a farmer, and Abel he's a shepherd, so he brings the firstborn of his sheep. Now, God actually favors Abel's sacrifice over Cain, and this infuriates Cain, and he decides to kill his brother. So Cain lures Abel into the field, and there he kills him with a rock. So this is the story from the Bible. So what as Sherman Alexie here has done is he's twisted it by making the rock into a kind of a crow. Now he uses this black crow to kill the brother, but suggesting that you're telling us that Christianity is good for us, but what does Christianity teach? That it teaches violence. In your teachings, there is a brother who's killed another brother out of jealousy, or because he's too vain or he's selfish. So he says, these are the teachings of your Bible. What are you teaching us? So also suggesting that there is a culture of violence, exploitation, which is inherent in Christianity according to him. So he says, the crow says, I guess this is just the beginning. And once this happens, then there are going to be a series of things that are going to take place. So there is a sense that that the poem is telling you that, giving you an alternate sort of a point of view on Christianity, and taking it further to, he hits out at this white race and their perspective, that he says is essentially this perspective is exploitative, underscoring the worldview harbored by the Native American people that is innately, he says, humanistic. So the Native American have a humanistic point of view and an ecological point of view, while the white man's basis of thinking, the premise on which they build everything is exploitative in nature. So the poem also takes a dig at these Christian missionaries, as I said, who telling that the Bible is deeply flawed and encourages a culture of violence and exploitation. Now, to quote another instance of exploitation here and violence, Alexie says in the poem, the white man disguised as a falcon swoops in and yet again steals a salmon from the crow's talon, right? So the white man is disguised as a falcon and swoops in and takes from the crow's talons a salmon. So you've taken the bread, you've taken food away from. So it's violence, it is exploitation, because you're a falcon. So you think you can take the crow's food and snatch it from the crow's talons. So in a way, the culture of exploitation is carried forward in here. He returns to another biblical reference in the poem to underscore the point, where that the Bible actually normalizes and sanctions violence as a way of life. He explains why the white settler has no qualms of committing genocide in their own land, to this large group of Native American people, and he says that this can be seen in the reference in the Bible from the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, where the Lord actually instructed the Israelites to destroy the city of Jericho and everything in it. So again, I quote from the poem. He says, among the ashes of Jericho, crow sacrifices his firstborn son. Damn, says crow, 1,000,000 nests are soaked with blood. Unquote.
No, this is the kind of literature that originates in the myth of religion, and from there it becomes more and more realistic as time passes by, and a new person coming from outside Christianity would definitely look at it different in a new way, and would like to learn the right kind of lessons. and therefore, as you said in the beginning, it's therapeutic, and it's also giving you a social role to play.
Yes.
You are in a way pointing out, you are asserting yourself in that world which should be yours also, because it belongs to you as much as it belongs to the white people.
Right, and he says that that these nests are soaked with blood, you know, and of course referring to the nests of the Native American people who were killed in large numbers. In fact, there have been instances where entire villages were set on fire at night when these Native American people would be sleeping, because you know they were stubborn people and they did not let go of their land very easily, and they were great fighters as well. But they were then when there was no way of buying, they would not you know give in to the temptation of money or anything. So they were the entire villages were set on fire at night by the white settlers. So in a way, I was reminded of that instance when I read this line from the poem where he says that a million nests are soaked with blood. Again, talking about the hypocrisy of also the white people, that you know it is your Lord instructs people to destroy cities. So you are obviously you normalize this kind of destruction or killing, and this is so against the very Native American culture that does not believe in killing one another or human beings. So such scenes, you find from the text give you a sense of how Alexie visualizes the white people's way of life based on the most sacred text that they believe in, and therefore projects that this is how an outsider would look at your life and your way of life. So in a way, towards the end, when he talks about, for instance, his own people in the same poem, that is Crow Testament, he says that he goes then towards the end, he comes to the life of the crow who's just picking up beer bottles one after another, and he says there is a sense of myth of the Sisyphus kind of routine work. This man goes and picks up one bottle, then comes back and does that again. So there is a kind of a cyclical sort of a vicious cycle that one is a part of, and it ends with, on the note, the poem actually ends on the note of tragedy in many ways, because he says that this crow actually sees, this crow is riding a pale horse, and in the Bible we are told that the death actually rides the pale horse. So in a way they are waiting for their death, and they know which is going to come sooner or later. So I think that's the kind of note that this poem actually strikes, both of very dark humor, macabre, satire, anger, and a sense of, but a sense of tragedy that one sees towards the end.
Yes, the point that you have made regarding Alexie is that he is able to use the available tools in order to criticize his supposed enemies, and he does so with the help of references that are actually the Christian references. So in a way, he is using literature in order to learn a lesson and to teach back to the people who are perpetrators of social injustice. So I think this is a nice point to begin with, and we will have friends. We are coming to the end of the first phase of this lecture, and in that lecture, history is traced of the Native Americans and their preferences vis-a-vis the threats that they get from the white population in America in the 19th and 20th centuries. So in the next part, we will have more of the poems written by Alexie and the way he would express himself there. Thank you.